You go along the Agora of ancient Athens, admire the marble columns and listen to philosophical disputes, and suddenly you notice what the blood becomes in the veins from. The girl, not older than 12, chained in a chain, drags onto the building, where her screams will sound for many more years. Ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and the foundation of Western civilization. But behind the sparkling marble facades and intellectual achievements, a system of female slavery was hidden, so cruel that even its description becomes a test for the human psyche. What you now find out is based on legal documents, judicial indications, and archaeological finds that reveal how the whole civilization built its well-being on the systematic destruction of female destinies. These were not isolated cases or cultural misunderstandings. It was an institutionalized policy that turned people into live property, where the value of a woman was measured exclusively by her ability to work and sexual operation. These practices were not deviations from the norm. They made up the foundation on which Greek society has been held for centuries. Before continuing, if you are interested in the hidden aspects of ancient history, subscribe and write in the comments where you look. It is amazing that we can together explore these forgotten stories from different parts of the world, united by a common desire to understand the past, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. The most psychologically destructive aspect of female slavery in ancient Greece was that it began even before the girls managed to form the first memories. Small children were bought specifically for sexual training, often even before they were performed for 5 years. The history of Nars gives a monstrous idea of how this process of systematic cultivation looked that modern human trafficking networks would seem primitive. Probably, Nara was born in Corinth, but her origin no longer mattered after her, abandoned by a baby, was picked up by a woman named Nicoreth. She immediately saw what promised huge profits, the potential of future beauty. Nicorete developed skill, which seems to be the summary of a real nightmare. She knew how to determine which girls left unattended will grow up the most attractive women. And she developed a system of education aimed at maximizing their values in society. The process was strictly systematic. Nicorete raised 7 girls from an early age in a house that looked like an ordinary family, while preparing them for life in conditions of hard use. She called them her daughters, creating the appearance of a family structure, which allowed her to count on the best opportunities for the future. The lifestyle she created was carefully thought out and severe. Representing girls as free and not dependent, she could count on a higher assessment of their skills and behavior. The education process itself showed the methodology of this approach. Children were not just subjected to random difficulties. They were taught music, dancing, communication, and the art of charm with the same attention to the details with which free children were taught mathematics and rhetoric. But this education was one main goal. Each skill was intended to make them prepared for life in a strictly structured system. Psychological training was as thoughtful as it was difficult. The girls were brought up with the conviction that their main role is to please others, and that their personal value depends on the ability to correspond to expectations. They were taught to compete for attention and approval, which even influenced their relationship with each other. When the girls reached adolescence, the next stage of their preparation for adulthood began. Nicorete gave their future guardians the opportunity to choose who would accompany them in the new phase of life, most often people from the rich layers of society, who perceived this process as an element of tradition and education. Prices levied for such transactions show the scale of this system. One night with a virgin slave could cost more than most free citizens earned in a whole year. After their first sale, these women faced the future, where there was not the slightest opportunity to escape or improve their position. They became pornai, the lowest category of prostitutes in Greek society, working in brothels, where they had no control of their body, nor over income, nor over their own lives. The conditions in which they existed make modern discussions of operation too soft compared to reality. A brothel worked with the effectiveness of any other enterprise. Women had to serve several customers daily, and all the earnings went to their owners. Power and housing were provided by minimal, only enough for them to function as a source of profit. Pregnancy was strictly prohibited, as it interfered with their accessibility for customers. Protection methods were primitive and dangerous, often turned on toxic substances that caused irreversible damage to the reproductive system. But sexual exploitation was only one line of horror that these women faced. The legal system of ancient Greece created a structure in which their abuses were not only acceptable, but also legally protected. Women slaves existed in a state of complete legal death. They could not own property, conclude contracts, or testify in court, except under torture. The logic of Greek law was sadistic. When the slaves were called to testify, they were stretched on the rack and beat them with a whip while they gave their evidence. The Greeks believed that slaves would tell the truth only under extreme pressure. Thus, the pain became a prerequisite for participation in the legal process. Many women died during these interrogations. Their bodies were literally destroyed in the process of extracting information that could not even be related to business. Physical violence spread far beyond the borders of judicial procedures and penetrated into all aspects of everyday life. The owners had the legal right to beat, stigmatize, and overshadow their slaves without any restrictions, except that they could not kill them directly. The ban on murder was not based on respect for human life, but for a practical reason: the dead slaves could not bring income. The branding was ordinary practice for both identification and punishment. Female slaves were marked by hot iron symbols that designated their owner and sometimes their specific function in the house. These brands served as a constant reminder that they are property. Visible scars guaranteed that they would never be able to impersonate free women, even if they managed to escape. The chains used to contain slaves were intended not only for safety, but also for psychological intimidation. Heavy iron shackles on ankles and wrists made it difficult to use the usual movement and served as a constant reminder of helplessness. Some slaves wore lighter chains that allowed to work, but prevented the escape, while others were kept in basements when they did not serve the owners. The normalization of this violence is perhaps the most frightening side of the entire system. Greek literature calmly mentions the beatings of slaves as a conventional home management technique. Philosophers, such as Aristotle, wrote in detail about the correct methods of monitoring the behavior of slaves through bodily punishment, considering human suffering as a technical problem requiring systemic solutions. Diostan, one of the most famous speakers of Athens, approved in court that bodily punishment is not only permissible for slaves, but also necessary to maintain public order. He stated that the body of the slave is responsible for all the misconduct, while bodily punishment should be an extreme measure for free citizens. It was not a controversial rhetoric designed to shock the audience. It was mainstream legal logic, reflecting widely accepted social values. The scale of female slavery in ancient Greece struck any historical standard. Archaeological data show that slaves ranged from 20 to 30% of the population in large cities, such as Athens, while women and children made up a significant part of this slave labor force. These were not prisoners of war or criminals serving a sentence. These were people, bought and sold as cattle in the markets that functioned openly around the Greek world. The slaves themselves worked with the effectiveness of modern commodity exchanges. Women were classified by age, appearance, skills, and sexual experience, while prices ranged depending on demand and supply. Merchants specialized in different types of slaves, some concentrated exclusively on young women intended for sexual exploitation. The business was so profitable that the rich Greeks invested in the trading of slaves in the same way that modern investors buy shares or real estate. The purchase process itself reveals the calculated dehumanization underlying Greek society. Potential buyers examined the slaves as cattle in the market. They checked their teeth for health, examined the bodies for scars or deformations, and tested their reaction to teams. Women were forced to demonstrate their bodies in front of a crowd of men who discussed their physical data as openly as they evaluated a horse or a bull. The most valuable slaves were those who could perform several functions in the house. A woman who was able to cook, clean, weaving, and satisfy the owner sexually cost more than the one who had limited skills. This economic logic created a real nightmare of universality, where women were supposed to master domestic arts along with sexual skills, knowing that insufficiency in any field could lead to the sale in worse conditions. Breeding slaves added another layer of horror to this system. Some rich Greeks managed that it can only be described as human propagation programs, choosing female slaves with desired features and forcing them to enter into relations with men workers selected for their complementary characteristics. Children born from these unions completely belonged to the owner, who could sell them, kill, or educate them for specific purposes inside the house. Women rabbits who became pregnant, faced an impossible choice that they themselves could not make. The owners usually forced abortion using primitive and dangerous methods, since pregnancy interfered with the usefulness of a woman for labor and sexual services. These procedures included toxic herbs, physical trauma, and rude instruments, which often led to constant damage or death. If the children were allowed to be born, they were immediately separated from their mothers. Women are forbidden to form emotional ties with their children, who were considered the property of the house, and not their children. Mothers, showing excessive attachment to their children, faced cruel punishments aimed at breaking these natural ties. The systematic destruction of unwanted slaves reveals the complete moral poverty of this system. Infants' races regularly died from the effects of cold, leaving, or direct murder, if the owners considered them economically unpromising. Women's children were especially vulnerable, since they were considered less valuable than boys for most forms of labor. Greek society has developed complex excuses for these practices, allowing free citizens to participate in systematic atrocities, without questioning their own moral character. Philosophers such as Aristotle argued that some people are born by nature slaves, and that their lower nature makes slavery useful for both the slave and the owner. This intellectual frame ensured a convenient justification for practices that any modern observer would recognize crimes against humanity. The religious dimension of slavery added spiritual torture to physical and psychological violence. Women were forced to participate in home religious ceremonies that glorified the system itself that enslaved them. They had to pour wine for libations in honor of the gods, which allegedly authorized their slavery, serve on holidays that celebrated the prosperity of their owners, built on their suffering, and support the sanctuaries dedicated to deities, which did not offer them either protection or hope. The most destructive aspect of religious participation was how it distorted the spiritual connection of slaves with any source of comfort. They could not turn to the gods for justice or freedom, because these same gods were depicted by supporters of the slavery system. This spiritual isolation aggravated their physical enslavement, leaving them without the possibility of divine intervention or posthumous justice. The economic network that supported female slavery extended throughout the Mediterranean, creating international trade in human suffering, which overshadowed the majority of legal commerce. The ships regularly transported the goods of enslaved women between Greek cities, and specialized merchants were registered with people in the same way as traders stored ceramics or grain. The profit from this trade has financed many cultural achievements that we associate with Greek civilization. Philosophical schools, theatrical productions that determined the classical culture, were built on a wealth extracted from the work of slaves, including the sexual exploitation of countless women, whose names are forever lost by history. The documentation of these practices was preserved with anxious thoroughness, because the Greeks were scrupulous keepers of the records and did not see anything shameful in their actions. This intellectual frame ensured a convenient justification for practices that any modern observer would recognize crimes against humanity. The religious dimension of slavery added spiritual torture to physical and psychological violence. Women were forced to participate in home religious ceremonies that glorified the system itself that enslaved them. They had to pour wine for libations in honor of the gods, which allegedly authorized their slavery, serve on holidays that celebrated the prosperity of their owners, built on their suffering, and support the sanctuaries dedicated to deities, which did not offer them either protection or hope. The most destructive aspect of religious participation was how it distorted the spiritual connection of slaves with any source of comfort. They could not turn to the gods for justice or freedom, because these same gods were depicted by supporters of the slavery system. This spiritual isolation aggravated their physical enslavement, leaving them without the possibility of divine intervention or posthumous justice. The economic network that supported female slavery extended throughout the Mediterranean, creating international trade in human suffering, which overshadowed the majority of legal commerce. The ships regularly transported the goods of enslaved women between Greek cities, and specialized merchants were registered with people in the same way as traders stored ceramics or grain. The profit from this trade has financed many cultural achievements that we associate with Greek civilization. The Platonovs of the Academy, philosophical schools, theatrical productions, which determined the classical culture, were built on a wealth extracted from the labor of slaves, including the sexual exploitation of countless women, whose names are forever lost by history. The documentation of these practices was preserved with anxious thoroughness, because the Greeks were scrupulous keepers of the records and did not see anything shameful in their actions. Legal contracts for the purchase of female rabies, economic reports reflecting the costs of maintaining enslaved women, and court cases related to disagreements regarding ownership of slaves are preserved in archives, providing undeniable evidence of systematic operation that existed for centuries. Perhaps the most terrifying, how deeply this system distorted the moral feelings of a free Greek society. Women who escaped from slavery or received freedom were in a world where their former suffering was considered natural and necessary. Free Greek women, despite their own limited rights, often participated in abuses in relation to slaves, considering their privileged position as a depending on the maintenance of a system that brutally oppressed others. Normalization of sexual violence against enslaved women created a culture in which rape was perceived as a crime against property, and not as a violation of human dignity. The owners who committed sexual violence against their slaves were not legal, since they simply used their property. The concept of consent in the legal system, which does not recognize slaves capable of giving or refusing to resolve anything, was meaningless. This systematic depersonalization covered all aspects of everyday life. Enthusiastic women could not choose their own names, select clothes, decide when to eat, either to sleep, or make any decisions regarding their bodies and time. They existed in a state of complete subordination, turned into living instruments made of flesh and blood instead of wood or metal. The psychological methods used to destroy the spirit of enslaved women were as sophisticated as modern brain-flushing programs. New slaves took place systematic procedures designed to destroy their individual identity and replace it with complete submission to the will of the owner. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native language, and punished for any behavior that indicated independent thinking or emotions. The scale and cruelty of female slavery in ancient Greece challenges our usual ideas about the fundamental foundations of Western civilization. Methods used to maintain psychological control reveal a thoughtful cruelty underlying Greek society. Enthusiastic women, showing signs of resistance, encountered punishments intended not only for causing pain, but also to serve as a warning to other slaves. Public beatings were a common occurrence. Slaves were forced to observe the torture of their companions as a reminder of their own vulnerability. The methods of isolation were especially destructive. Naughty slaves were often separated from others and were kept in solitary imprisonment for weeks or months, devoid of human contact, except in cases of use for work or sexual services. This social deprivation broke many women more effective than physical violence, turning them into the humble shadows of themselves. The owners used complex rewards and punishments, creating artificial hierarchies among enslaved women. Those who showed complete subordination could receive a little better handling, creating incentives for slaves to monitor each other's behavior and report on any signs of disobedience. This system turned victims against each other, preventing the formation of connections that could lead to collective resistance. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women went beyond individual houses and extended to organized networks of prostitution, operating around the Greek world. These enterprises functioned with commercial efficiency, which could impress modern business analytics, including standardized tariffs, quality control measures, and customer satisfaction protocols that turned human sexuality into mechanical transactions. Educational institutions for women intended for sexual exploitation worked as specialized schools, where young women mastered techniques aimed at maximizing their values for customers. They studied the preferences of various categories of customers, memorized scenarios for various situations, and worked out the behavior that contributed to repeated orders. The curriculum was comprehensive and terrible, covering everything, from physical techniques to psychological manipulation methods. A systematic cruel treatment of enslaved women in ancient Greece demonstrates how civilizations can create complex excuses for the most disgusting crimes against humanity. These women, enduring suffering, built marble temples that we admire today. Their stolen lives were financed by philosophical schools, claiming that they are looking for truth and justice. The evidence of this is preserved in the archives throughout Greece, carefully documented by society, which did not see anything reprehensible in turning people into commercial objects. Understanding this story does not mean condemnation of modern Greece or denial of the achievements of antiquity. It is about recognizing how easily entire societies can become accomplices in systematic dehumanization, if this serves as economic or social interests. The voices of these enslaved women were mainly drowned out by history, but their history requires to be heard as a reminder that the greatest monuments of civilization are often on the basis of unthinkable cruelty.